much beautiful and it pulls at your heartstrings through and through. So today, as we talked about, we're going to dive into Thais, which is an opera by Massenet, which you also know. We quarantined. I didn't think we did a book club of it yet, but we did Werther earlier this year, and probably his masterpiece that many know is Manon. And so a little bit about Massenet. In my notes, I wrote he's the baby brother of just a tiny family. He's just number 12. And his dad was a blacksmith. And many of his brothers, they turned into science and went into the military, and that was kind of their way. But lucky for us, his mother was a painter and a musician and his first piano teacher. And that kind of, especially once they moved to Paris, that's when she started teaching him piano. And they didn't stay there long. His dad got sick and they needed to move away. And from the stories I've read, he tried to run away. He did not like not being in Paris. And eventually they're like, okay, we're just going to let you live with your older sister. I don't know where she is on the line. Maybe she's number 3. But so he goes back to Paris and he starts studying. And right away they find out that he's like a piano prodigy, and more importantly, I think, is he's a very, very hard worker. So even probably at an early age, he was like, 9 a.m., I'm going to start playing piano and practicing. And so he develops his own unique, and that kind of filters into his composing life too. He was very much meticulous, like, nope, it's like, I'm going to write, whether it's good, bad, or whatever, every day I'm going to write. And so by 1859, he's won his first big piano prize. And then soon after, he moves into more composition. And the big deal that we have is in 1863, he won the Prix de Rome. And in that, a French composer, like, the biggest deal of it is that they are sent to Italy to study music for about a year. And I think a lot of inspiration happened for him once that happened. And he, even while he was on this trip, met his future wife, another brilliant pianist that was like, he was told to meet her by Franz Liszt. And so gives you kind of an idea where he's at. Maggie, interrupt me anytime. I'm just kind of going through all of the motions with Massenet real quick.
That's such a great job. I love it. You know, I always think it's interesting to see who people marry. And when it comes to musicians, musicians tend to, first of all, it's a very subjective field. So if you're recognized as a good musician and you choose to marry another good musician, in some instances, they actually rival the more famous person. I'm thinking of the Schumanns. If any of you have ever listened to Robert's music, his wife was also incredibly talented, Clara. And Robert was so determined to be the greatest piano player ever that he actually damaged his hands using a weird construct to strengthen his fingers. And Clara ended up having to play a lot of music for him. And, you know, when you think of today's world where we have 2 career households and, you know, there's a lot more, let's not say a lot, but there's a lot more equality in relationships. That is not how the world was structured in the time frames when these things were created. And so I love hearing that somebody married somebody who plays the same instrument as them and is also incredibly talented, and was introduced by another incredibly talented pianist. Liszt was really known for that, and he wrote beautifully for the piano. And you know, it's very hard to get a sense of who composers are because it's always seen through the eye of whoever's telling the story. But, you know, when we think of Massenet, I don't think of anyone who's acrimonious. We don't hear stories about him raging. He just didn't seem like that kind of a person. And anyone who would choose to become close friends with or marry someone of equal talent, I just think that speaks a lot about who they want to surround themselves with. And I'm sure you guys are getting tired of me getting excited about operas with strong women. This is a strong, complex woman who's written a little oddly, if I may say so. And I should start by saying I'm a huge fan of Massenet. I love his work. It's gorgeous. It's exactly what John was describing, lush and beautiful. And at one point, someone accused him of making music too easy. And his answer was, and yet art is so ideal to make life cheerier, to make the heart better, and the road more beautiful. And I'm like, and again, an elegant, I don't care. So this creator really wanted music to move us, to give us that moment of escape, to give us that moment of freedom and just riding the waves of gorgeous sound. And everything he wrote has that piece to it. He wrote one of my all-time favorite baritone arias, Vision Fugitive. I could listen to that for the rest of my life on repeat. Go enjoy, it's your homework. Looks like Vision Fugitive in English, but it's a stunner. At any rate, so I really love that he allows his music to carry us away, and that's what he's known for, is that musical component. I will not say he was the most talented chooser of librettists. Some of his stories are, the way they're created, they're just very set in time, and not necessarily the time when the story was set, but the time in which they were written. This is a very good example. So if you actually look through the dialogue, it makes it very difficult to stage this show in a way that we can enjoy today and really move with. And it's a fascinating story. So this high-level woman, high-class lady, so she's well-educated, she comes from a wealthy family, chooses to become a courtesan. And I'm trying to remember the time frame. Was it 4th century?
4th century.
Ago. He liked to go way far away in his plots, which is very cool because he was trying to take people away, right? So 4th century, this is a true story, true woman, theoretically.
Based on a saint.
Based on a saint, exactly. And so this well-to-do woman becomes a courtesan, and at some point is confronted with a man of faith who changes her mind, and she ends up joining a convent and dying there, which I am truncating this very much. But what's interesting and unfortunate here is, while the music is gorgeous and is, I don't know if you guys ever watched like Out of Africa, or a lot of his operas have that feel, lots of strings, gorgeous long lines, contemplative moments. But then you have this really clunky story where the guy who takes this sophisticated, educated, worldly woman, and instead of, helping convince her to change her ways and to change her life, he kind of yells at her and like browbeats her until she gives in. And I'm just not entirely sure that a woman described the way Thais is described would have been convinced by that kind of an argument. I don't know many of us that are like, you've been yelling at me for hours and now I agree with you. So this is one of the weaker points of this opera, but the opera itself is stunning. And I was thinking back, I got to see this in Montreal when I lived in Montreal, with Lynn Fortin and an almost entirely Canadian cast. And they were fantastic. And I just remember it feeling so exotic and otherworldly. And it wasn't the best staging. It wasn't the best, it wasn't remarkable. This wasn't a piece that people are still talking about decades later, the way it was done, but it was stunning musically. It just took your breath away. It didn't matter what the costumes looked like. It didn't matter what the staging looked like. The way the singers found stillness for these moments where the music really was the only thing you needed to care about, and the way they brought these characters to life really made it work. And I feel like if the libretto, and the libretto, by the way, is the words. So usually composers work with the librettist to write their text, and the librettist is the person who, for all intents and purposes, writes the dialogue, and then the composer sets it to music. They matter. We don't talk about librettists as much, but when you think about operas that are really funny, or where they're pithy and there's jokes happening and the audience is actually laughing out loud, that was one of my favorite moments with our Figaro this fall. was hearing the audience actually crack up at various points with the humor. A less talented librettist leaves you with these clunky moments where it feels like there's something missing, or a plot is, as we said, someone yelling at you instead of convincing you. I will tell you, though, that the piece is so beautiful, it just doesn't matter. So it's been interesting. And the reason I'm giving you this background is Massenet's pieces, aside from Manon, and he wrote many operas. This was his art form. John, is it 30 or 40?
The ones that are at least published, I got 24.
Okay.
Like, and then there's stuff that like post-death, like that they're like, oh, we discovered this and this. And so you're quite closer with the 30, 40, but the ones
I think it's 30.
Yeah.
The ones that we knew about when he was for 24. You know, it's really interesting because two fun facts. One, various pieces of his had their heyday in different cities around Europe. So each city has their Massenet explosion, and it was all with different pieces, which is really interesting because you think of a show like Carmen, another French opera, and Carmen was Carmen, and his other pieces were great, sure, but like that just took Europe by storm. And with Massenet, there's a different connection to all these different opera houses with all these different shows. And then second fun tidbit that I was just delighted by is, for those of you who know about our program for the coming season, we're doing a double bill in French with an opera written by an 84-year-old woman named Pauline Viardot. And Pauline Viardot was a famous pianist, another pianist, a famous singer, and a famous composer. She was also friends with Franz Liszt. I believe he was her piano teacher. And she was one of the singers that inspired Massenet. And he wrote a beautiful oratorio that really did take Europe by storm. Marie Madeleine, maybe. That would make sense. And he wrote it for her. He's another composer who wrote for the singer, who wrote for that specific voice, and he loved her instrument. So I was so excited because I'm like, oh, look, she's everywhere. But he did fall in love with specific voices, specific singers, and then adapted his music for them. And I don't believe he readapted it afterwards. We had talked about some really efficient composers who would, you know, listen to a rehearsal and decide the singer couldn't sing it that way and rewrite it for different voices. I don't believe Massenet was one of those, but he did truly create with a specific sound and a specific person in mind, and that's beautiful. John, I don't know if you want to tell them about his favorite soprano.
Absolutely. Real quick question to you, Maggie. Like, so I don't know what the costumes were, but every time I read another thing about Thais, it's one of the few operas that like they credit the costume designer as much as they have 2 acts where they get a costume designer gets to go over the top decadent with, and so it's funny, like the Met, like it's like, oh, we have Renee Fleming, and then within 2 sentences they say costume designed by this famous designer, because they get a chance to like dive into that,
really shine. Part of that's because the cast isn't enormous either. Like, you have some really focused main characters. This was Montreal in the 2000s, so it was like modernistic Star Trek-y kind of.
Okay.
So I'm sure it was a very notable designer, and I'm sure it was a very sophisticated choice. I just remember at that age watching it, I was like, this is not what I expected.
So when we look at Thais, the inspiration for this was like what people think of as his, like, of the women that he was very inspired to write for. Her name was Sybil Sanderson, and she was an American soprano. Very young one too. Like, from what I understood, like I think her dad had passed, and her and her mom, they went to France and they lived there. I think they were very wealthy beforehand. And I think she was 22 when they first met each other. But the big thing is, I guess she had an incredible range. She had like a 3-octave, like no holes range, with some depth at different spots, and great stage presence. On top of that, I don't know that she necessarily had, I think she had probably an incredible 3-octave range, but not necessarily the biggest voice, because the things you would read is that she was loved in France and loved in Europe, probably in general. But then she came and premiered Thais at the Met, and America was like, no. And so it must have been too big of a house, like, because just the house, like how big an opera house, it changes the dynamic of what a voice can do. And so either way, he was very, very much inspired by the soprano. We don't know if they're like, right now, we don't know if there was a love affair or anything like that. We do know that whenever she would sign her letters to him, your Manon. And so, there was this at least flirtation between the two of them. And going back to kind of Maggie talking about where Massenet just kind of wrote what he felt or whatever. It's funny, the amount of articles I kept reading that started their article, poor Massenet. And then, and then they would go on, and then they're like, well, he laughed it all the way to the bank because he was selling lots of tickets in his time, and then longevity has done well for him. But you get this weird, and we talked about this over the last few weeks, that you have like this critic society that like exalts one thing, and then you have popular society. And so I've always kind of come to opera where I'm just like, what do you mean they're not critically acclaimed? I'm like, they just took us and like ripped our souls apart. But
exactly.
And so, but we just have to kind of read it with a grain of salt. For instance, I'm reading, I put a quote out from a history book that I read in either undergrad or grad school. And it said, his operas exhibit a talent for suave, sensuous, charming, and often sentimental melody. Qualities also appreciated in France. And I'm like, it kind of is like a compliment and also just like a backhand all at the same time. And so,
but it's true. I mean, this opera and his operas in general are the most French thing you will ever hear. I mean, they are long and languorous and gorgeous, and there's always beautiful women, and there's always romance and heartbreak, and whether they're dark and torturous like Werther, it's in a very French, like, visual way. I mean, I'm not surprised by the costume designer always being key with Thais, because I do feel his pieces cry out for that visual interpretation. I mean, they really need to have the costumes and the scenes, and the emotions are so intense in his pieces, and the topics he chooses are so extreme. I don't know if anyone, actually, I see Emery's are on, they'll know what I'm talking about. There's a classic called Le Cid that is, again, a very intense princess story, beautiful, exceedingly French classic. He said that in an opera. Nobody else has done that to my knowledge, because it's so emotion driven that it would be very hard to do on stage. And yet, because of how he writes music, it's never a problem. You feel all the feelings. Like, it's just, and so as we look, he hit a lot of biblical topics. He apparently was working on a Cleopatra when he died, I believe. And I don't know that that ever got finished, but he looked for the stories about living large and heartbreak. And I think that was really where he found his subjects that moved him the most, and that therefore move us the most. But if you are looking for operas with duels and beheadings and, you know, everything imaginable from this era, he will serve you well. He will give you everything you are looking for. And in the meantime, if you want to put an opera on while you are puttering around on a Saturday, I cannot recommend Thais enough. You will stop dead in your tracks in a few moments, because the music will just overtake you. It will just, and the soprano part, it requires so much float. And as John talked about, so many octaves. I don't think you could physically have a heavier voice and do this. I think you have to have a really delicate, beautiful instrument that can just keep moving all the time, because there are passages in this where I do remember sitting in that seat and thinking, how is she not breathing yet? Because they are so high and they go on for so long that you almost stop breathing with her. So
Speaking of which, do
I
you
was
want
gonna
to hear,
say, I bet John's got
the
something.
clip? So I hope this clip also shows, because Renee Fleming is dressed to the nines, and if not, go back to the clip and you'll see this dress have a train that goes on for days. But here is Renee Fleming singing in the role of Thais. It's about a 4.5 minute aria. There's lots of many beautiful moments in it. I was like, okay, I'm a sucker for a high note though, so I went right to the end. And the poor soprano has to end on a note just like that. Like, she sees the face of God, and of course, if you see the face of God, you need to sing at least a high C or above, and then she dies after singing that note forever and ever.
Sure, she wants to die, so that works out really nicely. Sinking to the stage after you've sung that long of a high note probably feels real good. Well, I think John's got one more clip, and I'd love to share a little bit of that with you because we got a write-in that we'd love more clips. So we're listening. We're going to include this. And then if you guys have any questions, we're all ears.
Cool. Here is the finale then. And you'll get to hear that big last clip. That last clip. I don't necessarily love Renee's just like, I'm gonna collapse into my chair, but beyond that, a beautiful moment. And there's many beautiful moments, and especially in this one, the costumes, just as she goes through different scenes, like the first outfit she comes on is like all gold and very like over the top, but in a really good way, kind of like a Sonny and Cher show. It's like, great, get Bob Mackie, make all of the clothes. And so we have any questions?
So one last note I want to make just before we open this up to everyone is, you know, when you, oh my goodness, you made me laugh and now I can't remember my comment. Hang on, it'll come back. Oh yeah. So I had talked about like the heart-wrenching agony of the stories that Massenet chooses. In this instant, the man who converts her truly to Christianity then discovers he's really madly fallen in love with her at first sight, and he's a monk, so that's wrong. So now he's tortured and she's tortured and everyone's tortured, and then she dies. Right? So it's a nice uplifting piece. But if you need to have a really good cry and get some feelings out, this is totally your show. And it's so beautiful. Like, it's going to be therapeutic and moving and gorgeous, and like watching a period Bronte show where you go in knowing it's going to be dark and gorgeous, and you're just going to, you know, saddle up and be ready with your Kleenex. So as you explore Thais, please keep that in mind. I encourage you again to go listen to Vision Fugitive, like the most gorgeous thing ever written. And does anyone have questions or comments? I know we're coming very close to our time here, but this is a fun one. Barbara?
Would you say what you just said in French again?
Vision fugitive.
Okay, d'accord.
It looks like vision fugitive. So if you're Googling it, that's what you go with.
I think John's drink suggestion was very appropriate. Good and the evil. Because I really think this is a almost like one of these medieval, forget what they called them, but these tales, you know, where you would have the triumph of good over evil. And she's, Dr. Fauci is with me, by the way. He's agreeing with everything. He wants you to all flatten the curve. But anyhow, she starts out being a more or less evil woman that everyone desires. And then he convinces her that she should only desire God. And she goes off in the desert with him. And in the one clip that with Renee Flemings and him singing the duet, the settings show, you know, they had the shifting sands made out of concrete or something, and it was just striking, and the whole opera set was beautiful. It really engages you, and she and he sang this duet about, you know, bringing her water and that, and her voice got so soft and his was so gentle. It was just romantic, but soulful, you know. So, and then on the website there was a discussion of people, you know, different people writing back in French and in Spanish and English, and the French speakers didn't feel that she pronounced the French words very well. Well, I mean, who on that? It's just
I was going to say, linguists have a heyday with singers because we all have to learn to sing all these languages we may know and we don't know. And usually there's some you're better than others.
And it's how it sounds, not how you say it. You know?
Well, I was going to say, most people are worried less about the diction than the singing, but we all know many others who have concerns.
Catherine, we have a chat. We want to know where you got Dr. Fauci. In the chat.
You must know that Milwaukee is the home of the Bobblehead Museum, and
yes, as we all nod.
They'll have they offered this one, and that other doctor with the scarves, you know, she's got a bobblehead too.
Well, Catherine, we want to thank you for bringing the safety to our quarantine meeting. And I saw Steve put a mask on, and the Spreckers applauded you for bringing Dr.
Oh, we are all about safety, guys.
We are.
We're good over here.
You can sing as loud as you want while you're in quarantine.
Right. No super spreading here.
And for those of you who got quarantine t-shirts, I feel like I see one of you on every call.
Yeah, there's Georgia and John. Yeah.
I just love it.
Oh, well, if there's nothing else, guys, I want to again say thank you so much for joining us. Those of you week after week, those of you who are popping on for the first time, thank you. This is fabulous for us, Maggie and John, as always. Thank you. Fabulous job. I always feel smarter because I couldn't even pronounce the name when we started. So, and also thank you to Rotary Club of Milwaukee. So, Steve, thank you for your mask too and bringing safety to us as well. And remember, we're not here next week. We're taking a little break. So we'll see everybody on the flip side on Wednesday, the 22nd.
That's right.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Good luck.